Hello everyone, welcome to English Language Resource. This is Idrisa. In today's presentation, I'm going to give you the line by line explanation and analysis of the poem The Listeners, written by Walter de la Mare. Is there anybody there? Said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses of the forest's ferny floor. The opening lines of the listeners introduce the poem's main character, set the scene, and pose the question that is central to the mystery of the story. The fact that the traveler knocks on a moonlit door establishes the poem's setting as a house at night, while the ferny floor of a forest reveals that the house is located in a wood. The presence of ferns further suggests that the forest has grown wild around the house, and inhabitants might have been absent for a while. The traveler's question shows the sense of urgency, and knocking the door in the middle of night depicts that he must have a compelling reason. The reader is therefore encouraged to read on in order to find out what his errand entails and what kind of response he will get. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. Is there anybody there? He said. These lines bring some sort of response to the traveller's question, but not the one what he was expecting. The another fact is that a bird has been living in the tower of the house gives an impression that the place is abandoned. The traveler repeats his knocking and his question, which in turn shows the increased urgency, and this time knocking and striking violently with a great deal of force and a longer period of knocking. He repeats his question even more desperately for someone to answer. All these actions suggest that the traveler's attempts are useless and does not produce any effect. But no one descended to the traveler. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. The traveler expects that someone will emerge from the house to speak to him or at least lean out of the window to acknowledge his presence. Neither of these things happen, and the reversal of his expectations confuses the traveler and momentarily stops him in his tracks. Here, the language of these lines focuses on absence and negation, and the silence and stillness of the wood absorb even the traveler for the moment. The grey eyes of the traveler, as described by the poet, represent a meeting point of two states, as grey is an achromatic color, that is, the meeting of the living and dead. In the course of the poem, the traveler is able to come close to the world of ghosts, while he himself is a representative of the human world. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwell in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. These lines introduce the other characters in the poem. Here, the perspective of the poem shifts from outside of the house, from the traveler to the inside of the house towards listeners. The inhabitants of the house are described as a host of phantom listeners. The word host implies a large number of people or anything. This description also underscores their supernatural nature, that is, they are phantom presences or ghosts or some kind of separate, not living people. In either case, they are of a different world from the traveler, who appears as a voice from the world of men. The ghosts or listeners are inhabiting the house, but it is unclear how long they have been there. Their tenancy might be temporary, or they might be the original inhabitants of the house who are now ghosts, or might be spirits from somewhere else. Again, the moonlight appears here as a signal of the paranormal in the context of this poem. The listening beings which stand among the rays of the moon in the dark house emphasizes their mysterious nature. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. These lines add to the image of the listeners in the house, honing in on their experience of the traveller's voice. The use of thronging emphasizes the large number of the listeners crowded together, filling the staircase. For the listeners, the traveler's call is worth paying attention to. The sound of his call physically shakes up the air around them, and the stillness of the forest house in which they have been dwelling, but it notably does not provoke movement in the listeners themselves. The traveler's call comes from a lonely source. Here, the focus is on the singleness of the traveler as he is the only living being present. And he felt in his heart the strangeness, the stillness answering his cry, while his horse smote, cropping the dark turf, neath the starred and leafy sky. At this point, the traveler recognizes the presence of the listeners in his heart and understands they are not human beings, though it is not a logical understanding but an emotional one. The listener's silence is not a complete lack of response to the traveler but an indication of their existence, their attention. Meanwhile, the traveler's horse continues to behave as if nothing is abnormal about the situation. Either the horse is unaware of the supernatural presences or ghosts do not distress the animal. This suggests that the horse, unlike its human rider, blends easily into the landscape of the forest, grazing on the grass under the leaves and the stars. For he suddenly smote on the door, even louder, and lifted his head. Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word, he said. Here the traveller reached some sort of understanding about the occupants of the house. The traveller made one more effort to get through to them. So once again he banged on the door even louder than before. Then he lifts his head in order to project his voice as loudly he can into the house and leaves a message with the listening phantoms. The traveler asks the listeners to tell an unnamed them that he kept his promise by coming to the house, but was thwarted by the absence of an answer. Here, the lack of context in the traveler's speech makes the poem's mystery even more frustrating. Leaving his message with the listeners is an act of desperation for the traveler. He certainly cannot be confident that his words will be passed on by such a silent force. However, the situation leaves him with no alternative. Never the least tire made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left away. These lines depict that listeners do not stare in response to the traveler's final words. In line 31, the longest of the poem, the words continue to reverberate through the quiet house. De la Mare is using awake in an unconventional sense to contrast the traveler's living state with the ghostliness of the listeners. In art and literature, death has frequently been compared to sleep. The listeners are possibly in their final sleep. The listeners are possibly in the final sleep, one that separates the living from the dead. Aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of the iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. There is a sense of claustrophobia in the reading of these final lines, that is, of being stuck in the uncanny, motionless house as the only human gallop sways. Each step of the traveler's departure is detailed, echoing the listener's deep attentiveness. They hear his foot hitting the metal riding support as he mounts his horse, and the sound of the horse's hoofs hitting the stone path. Finally, when the fast moving hoofs have disappeared, they hear the return of silence. The image apparently displayed in the final lines through sound is that of the traveler departing. However, once more, that presence of what is not described is strong. It is the atmosphere of the supernatural world, and it's stronger than any human attempt to break into it. Here we end with analysis and explanation of poem. Hope you understand. Write in the comment box for queries and suggestions.